Hey friends, welcome back to Fantasy Awash. Today we are going to be discussing if The Dance of Dragons was the best choice to be adapted from George R. R. Martin's book, Fire and Blood. Let's jump in. So for those who aren't familiar, which I don't see how you would be at this point, George R. R. Martin is a famous fantasy author. He is most famed for writing his series, which is Incomplete, which is A Song of Ice and Fire. This was adapted to become the wildly successful and global phenomenon Game of Thrones. Because of this success, and George R. R. Martin wanting to expand upon the world, maybe rather than finish this story, he then wrote a book called Fire and Blood. Fire and Blood is the focus on the history of the Targaryens. Targaryens were a prominent family that are still in our story in Game of Thrones. However, Fire and Blood takes us through their whole history up until the point that these people know it. So I want to talk about the book Fire and Blood, and then I want to talk about other stories that could have been adapted and why they went with The Dance of Dragons. So as I said, Fire and Blood is basically a history book. However, it's interesting in the way that it's written because it's being written and read by someone that is looking at primary sources. So the person that is telling us our story is a maester, and maesters in this world go to study at a place called Citadel. They can specialize in things like medicine, history, philosophy, diplomacy, all kinds of different things. And this maester seems to be more interested in history, and he is looking at the reign of the Targaryens, and he's looking at the primary sources that were available for each time period. Now, the story really begins with the arrival of Aegon the First, Aegon the Conqueror, and his family departing from Old Valyria to what became Dragonstone, and then the conquering of Westeros. Aegon is famed because he was the rider of Balerion, the Black Dread, who grew to be the largest dragon that there ever was. He was the unifier of the Seven Kingdoms. He didn't manage to get Dorne, actually, but he was able to get everybody else to submit and rule as one unified kingdom, and thus establish the Targaryen lineage and dynasty that carried on up until Daenerys in A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, this is a really interesting way of telling a story because we can see the biases in the primary source materials, which I thought was really interesting because if I am a historian by trade, so I find that this is very accurate. I like the way that this is portrayed. When you are reading particular things by certain authors, you can definitely sense that yes, this may have been influenced in a way, that their personal biases are coming into this narrative that they're telling, as opposed to what actually may have historically happened. So I really like the approach that Martin set up for this book, this telling. I thought it was a great way to broach history, and a lengthy history at that. The original story that we are told in the book is the arrival of Aegon and all of the wars that it takes to conquer Westeros, to have him submit, for him to be named the first king, the expansion of King's Landing, what that looks like, and it then gets into his successors and their reigns, so on and so forth. And in this story, it doesn't give the full history of the Targaryens. This is supposed to be a part one. We don't know when part two is coming out. But within part one, there are several options that I think would have been good candidates to be adapted. And even in the Targaryen history as a whole, there are really good points and stories that could be adapted. So I want to talk more about those now. I think that if you were to have a story about the Targaryens, it would be most interesting to go back and talk about Old Valyria, their wars, and the Doom. The Doom was an explosion that basically destroyed Old Valyria. Old Valyria is where the Targaryen family hailed from. While they're very prominent and relevant in Westeros, they were actually one of the lesser Dragon Lord families in Old Valyria. Now, one of the Targaryens was a dreamer. She was able to see things in her dreams. She foresaw that there was going to be a destruction of Valyria, so she and her family packed up all of their stuff, moved on over to Dragonstone, planted themselves there, and then that's where Aegon's story really begins. I think that this would have probably been your best starting point for an adaptation because it gives you so much. You can start in Essos in Old Valyria. We can see what that's like. We can see what the process of taming the dragons is like with dealing with blood magic. We can then see the Doom. We can see the development of Dragonstone. We can see what our Westeros looked like 300 more so years earlier. We can see how the relationships and dynamics worked because at many points in this story, at least in Aegon's story, these are independent kingdoms. We can see how they rule, how they run. We can see all of these houses that no longer exist. This to me was the solid choice. It opens you up to so many possibilities, and it's a series that could have gone on for many, many years, as there are pivotal moments in this story. And it seems a waste, in my opinion, that this isn't the route that they chose to go and instead went with the Dance of Dragons, but we're not there yet, so we're gonna keep going. If you look at the end of Aegon's story, now this is a little bit spoilery, so if you don't want to know much about this or plan on reading Fire and Blood, that's fine. I'm gonna give you 5 seconds to turn off. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So when Aegon dies, we get into his succession issues. And this is where issues between the Targaryens really start to emerge because Aegon had 2 wives, both of whom were his sisters. As we know, the Targaryens practiced ancestral marriage, and Aegon was very much part of that. It seemed that his first wife, Visenya, was his least favorite wife, and his second wife, Rhaenys, was his preferred wife. We're not sure who he would have really preferred as his heir. It seems like he would have preferred Rhaenys' son. However, Maegor the Cruel is Visenya's son, and that becomes a whole war, a whole dynamic. And that's something that you could have then added on to the end of a conquest series if you really wanted to show how there is inner fighting amongst the Targaryens. We're not going to get the big epic dragon battles at this point, but it still would have made for really interesting television because I feel that Game of Thrones was at its best when it was dealing with plot, conversation, and politicking and moving slow. So I think if they could have continued that and maybe applied it to this, it would have also been a really interesting option. There is another storyline in Fire and Blood that I don't think would maybe have been as interesting, but it depends on whether or not you want to show more political back end or if you want to show more CGI, dragons, explosions, etc. Now, the reign of Jaehaerys, who was the good king, he reigned for a very, very long time, but the way that he came to power was very interesting. His marriage coming about was very problematic, and then he went on to have 8 or 9 children, and none of them survive him, and that's what led to the Great Council. Now, the Great Council is where we begin in the adaptation House of the Dragon, except they've changed a little bit of the dynamic of what was actually going on at the Great Council. But the vie for succession with Jaehaerys for a political show would have been so interesting. And I would have really liked to see this because I myself hate animal death. I know that dragons aren't real. I get it, I know. However, when watching the original series, Game of Thrones, I about lost my mind every singular episode that a wolf died or a dragon died. I did not cope well, and this would have been okay because there isn't really much dragon death in this story. So this for me would have been a very solid choice, and I would have been very, very happy with it. However, the last story I want to talk about before we talk about the dance is the Blackfyre Rebellion. Again, the Blackfyre Rebellion I think would have been a really interesting option. It's much more politics heavy. There's not dragons fighting each other. It is Targaryens fighting themselves. It is one branch of Targaryens that were bastard-born Targaryens and one branch of Targaryens that were legitimate-born Targaryens who have a civil war basically against each other. It's super interesting, and if we're looking at that story, it leads into the storyline of Dunk and Egg. The Dunk and Egg storyline and stories as a whole are actually published in a book. They're called The Night of the Seven Kingdoms. You can see it basically right there, right there. So they're actually talking about adapting Dunk and Egg into a miniseries for HBO. So again, you could have done a bigger series where they kind of blended and blended into each other, but they chose to go with the Dance of Dragons. Now, in the book itself, Fire and Blood, The Dance of Dragons is about 50 pages, so it's really not a lot of material. And within this story, we have the basically fighting between what has been called the Blacks and the Greens. The Blacks are Team Rhaenyra Targaryen, and the Greens are Team Alicent Hightower. This comes from the fact that King Viserys was originally married to Aemma Arryn, and they had only one child, a daughter, Rhaenyra Targaryen. At this point in Westerosi history, a daughter would never be able to succeed her father as king, and therefore it played into the question of succession. Aemma Arryn then dies in childbirth as Viserys is king and is still relatively young. It is expected that he will take another wife. He ends up marrying Alicent Hightower, who is the daughter of the Hand of the King. They go on to have 3 sons and a daughter, and their eldest born is a son. His name is Aegon, and this becomes the issue and conflict between who will succeed Viserys. This all sounds interesting on paper, but it's 50 pages, and within that 50 pages, most of it is dragon fighting, and that's what ends up happening. It says in the book, the storm broke and the dragons danced, and that's because there is a massive storm and 2 of the boys, one of the Blacks, one of the Greens, get into a dragon battle. One of the Blacks is killed, and thus the Dance of Dragons, as it's called, begins. Almost all the dragons are wiped out in this storyline, and it's sometimes by fighting from the people of the 2 factions. It's sometimes by random groups of people, which is a whole other thing that George R.R. Martin scarred me with in this book. But this is a CGI dream adaptation. While the plot itself is interesting, but it's mostly based on dragons. And that to me makes it probably the least interesting of all the possible ones that could be adapted. If we're wanting to really expand the world, we could have done Aegon's Conquest. We could have done the Blackfyre Rebellion. We could have done so many other things, but instead we chose to focus on dragons because dragons bring in money. One of the things that was revolutionized by Game of Thrones was the fact that they were able to use CGI in the way that they did with television. At one point, Game of Thrones was the most expensive show. This has definitely been, I believe, surpassed by The Rings of Power on Amazon. But Game of Thrones altered the way television is made, especially with CGI. And people frothed over dragons. I'm not gonna lie, I loved some of the dragon stuff that they did. It just, to me, isn't the most interesting. And I have opinions on the adaptation itself. Overall, I feel that they've done a good job with the adaptation for the first season. However, I think they're going to be facing a problem come season 2 and season 3 in that it's not plot heavy, it's fighting heavy. And for people that like political intrigue and dialogue and character development, we're not going to get a whole lot of that in the next 2 seasons. Let me know in the comments down below if you have read Fire and Blood, if you refuse to read Fire and Blood until George R.R. Martin publishes another book, if you have watched House of the Dragon, what your feelings are on it. I'm open to all of these things. If you feel like there is an adaptation they should do, let me know in the comments down below. If you would like to help support my channel, you can always hit like and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. And if you would like to follow me on Instagram, you can find me at Fantasy Awash. As always, I'll see you next time.